Well, good morning, El Paso Bible Church, to our Sunday School Hour. We're here in Daniel chapter 6, if you're just joining with us. Last week we did Daniel chapter 5, and there's a very crucial transition that takes place between chapter 5 and chapter 6. You remember that right immediately following Belshazzar's feast, in which he saw the handwriting on the wall, which has become a Western civilization reference to a declared end, end to some proposition or some enterprise that we have. That's where this comes from. And it's because the Medes and the Persians overtook the kingdom of Babylon here on this night. And the very night that Belshazzar saw the writing on the wall was the night his life was required of him. And that night he was slain. And Darius the Mede became the king over Babylon. Now, it's really kind of beyond the scope of what we normally do in a Sunday school lesson. But there's about 4 different views on who Darius the Mede is and what his other names might be. But let's suffice it to say that this is the Medo-Persian Empire, and Darius, in one form or another, is a king that is under Cyrus, the Persian, who is king of the empire, and whoever this king is king over the kingdom of Babylon, which is a kind of a vassal kingdom to the Medo-Persian Empire at this point. Now, if you about the other 4 options, or not the other 4, but the 4 options. Every one of the 4 options describes Darius in one form or another in that way. It's just his positive actual identity in relationship to Cyrus is a little bit in question. But he's now the king of Babylon. Functionally, there's no interference in that relationship to the kingdom. He is the king, Darius the king. And so at 62 years of age, which means that at this time frame in human history, he's fairly advanced in years. He was the age of 62 when he became king of Babylon. And verse 1 of chapter 6 says this. I hope that you have your Bibles open, however you choose to have them open. Verse 1 of chapter 6 says this. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, and that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. So one of the first things that we read about Darius the Mede doing as king is to create a bureaucracy, essentially. I mean, he's appointing executive officers in different locales, 120 of them, satraps. That's what that kind of a local governor is really all that means, probably equivalent to our mayor, although they were probably better at what they did than our mayor. That wouldn't be that difficult to do. But they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. In other words, he's divesting himself basically of the administration of the kingdom to these local governors, and he puts 3 commissioners, 3 guys in charge of these guys. And Daniel is one of them, of whom Daniel was one. And these satraps, the local governors, were supposed to be accountable to them. And the whole point was to prevent corruption in the kingdom, in order that the taxes would get paid properly, that the taxes that came out of the people's pockets would go into the king's coffers directly without any interference or corruption involved, that there would be a strict accounting of what they did and the decisions that they made. So, verse 3 says, Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Now, the way that I read this, I mean, it could be that he's creating an extra layer of authority so that Daniel is now over all the satraps, or, and this is possibly very, very likely, I mean, Daniel's very, very efficient. He has a tremendous gift for operating in a position of administrative authority, it seems to me, that all of their jobs are at risk, and that Daniel is actually going to take over the administration of the entire kingdom from these other 122 guys. Now, there's not a hill that I'm going to die on in either way, but it seems like they take offense to that that's at the root of this system, of this problem that he's about to have with these commissioners and satraps. Because verse 3 says he's about to appoint Daniel over the entire kingdom, which was what the satraps and the commissioners were to rule over, had been ruling over. It says, And the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation. Nothing. No ground of accusation in a government official. No evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful. and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Now listen, I have never met a government official, whether elected or hired or appointed, that I could find nothing to complain about. Now you may say, John, that's because you're a pessimist. That's not true. It's because they're human and I'm human. Daniel is presented almost in this superhuman light as a guy who makes no mistakes. Now, understand that these are fallible human beings that are looking for something. This isn't saying that Daniel didn't make any mistakes or have any problems, but they couldn't find anything that would do what they needed to be done. They couldn't find anything that would stand on two legs before the king and say, look, this is a valid thing, and Daniel needs to at least not be in charge of the whole kingdom. He at least needs to not replace 122 of our jobs. He at least needs to be bumped down a few notches because he's not perfect. And that's the way he's being perceived. He is distinguishing himself. Now, you got to remember, Daniel has been doing this a long time. He's not a young man anymore. We're introduced to him probably as a teenager, but he's been around for 50 years or so, more than that. He's kind of elderly, especially in terms of his day at this time. And he continues to distinguish himself. He continues to do that. I've been told over the years many times by people that were older than myself how difficult it is to continue to distinguish yourself in whatever realm you're in, whether it's business, politics, ministry, any of those things, to continue to innovate, to continue to pursue excellence, to continue to be sharp, really, to be distinct among those who are doing the same thing, the same function. But Daniel does that over and over and over again. It's really amazing. And they could not find one thing that they could stand bold-faced before the king and say, Daniel is worthy of some accusation. They couldn't find it. And a man who'd been in government service for 50-something years. That's remarkable. Really remarkable. 120 politicians. Think about it this way. 122 politicians are trying to find a skeleton in his closet, and they fail. They can't do it. So here, when they can find no violation of the law, they have to do something. And these men, in verse 5, these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. In other words, no existing law, and this is an established kingdom, an established set of laws, very functional, able administration taking place in this place. Daniel is excelling himself in administering these things. They say, we can't find anything that's an existing law that he's in violation of. We've got to make a new law. Now listen, this is why I despise bureaucracies, because this is what they do. They can't exist if no one violates their laws or their principles or their municipal code or their orders. They make new ones in order to trip you up. They make new ones in order to make you a violator and an offender, because they need to justify their existence, not because there's anything morally just with what they're doing. And it has a long history. It goes back to Daniel and before. But they know that they need to now take the law and they need to massage it. They need to change it in order to make something that Daniel recognizes as a higher law. They need to make that illegal in Babylon. And so that's what they're going to do. They go to the king. It says, verse 6, these commissioners and satraps, 122 of them roughly, came by agreement. In other words, they were premeditated. They didn't just all happen to be there in front of the king's court and do this on a handshake and a whim. It says, we will, King Darius live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. The temporary emergency executive order, isn't it? 30 days, you're not allowed to pray to anything. 30 days, your rights are suspended. We see incidents in which local governments, even today, tell you this is your First Amendment zone, right? The First and Second Amendment zone, where this is where you have your freedom of speech. This is where you have your freedom of religion. This is where you have your freedom to carry, to keep, and bear firearms. It's not radically different than what has happened here. They're saying for 30 days, this is your area. This is your expression. You don't have to pray to anybody, but if you pray to somebody, it needs to be King Darius the Mede. No, that rubs the king the right way, doesn't it? Scratches his little itch right behind his little ear. Now, that sounds like a great idea. I'm a wise and capable leader, and I can certainly address people's requests in my own kingdom, and this is no problem. Well, of course, we're talking to a man who prays to a brick, or something akin to a brick's cousin, a piece of firewood, or whatever, part of the creation. And he's not wrong if he compares himself to his own gods. He is more capable than his own gods. And so he makes this an injunction. He makes it the law. They say, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. In other words, the Medes and the Persians came up with a really good idea. And actually, I do agree that it is a good idea. Because, frankly, governments make a lot of foolish laws. If you have to be a lawyer to understand the laws of your country, you have too many laws written by too many lawyers. And this was designed to caution people. It was designed to caution the leaders from making unnecessary, unenforceable laws. The law of the Medes and the Persians made it irrevocable. And when you signed it as the king with full authority, with your signet ring, and bam, you stamped that sucker, you were not allowed to revoke, exchange, alter, or anything to that law. It stood. And so you better think long and hard before you sign it. That part of the process didn't happen here. We just have about 122 politicians come and scratch the king's itch, and he signs the injunction. So just because it was well-intentioned, and actually, it was admirable. It was an admirable change to the way that governments often worked in the ancient Near East. It was not applied properly in this case. So, he signs the injunction. Therefore, King Darius signed the document that is the injunction. Now remember, Daniel is one of these commissioners. If there's official paperwork or official whatever, clay tablets going out from the king, he sees it, he knows it. It doesn't get past him. And so he understands this situation. Right? He knows. With full knowledge, Daniel knew that the document was signed. He knew what it meant. He knew what the law of the Medes and the Persians was. He knew that there was no exception. He knew that there was no alteration. He knew that his position would not save him from the consequences of his actions. He also knew that he could avoid punishment by petitioning and praying to no one. Rather than praying or petitioning to the king, he could just pray to no one. So, verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open towards Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. He continued with full knowledge. He engaged in what we would call civil disobedience. He decided that the order of sovereignty had now been flip-flopped in the kingdom of Babylon in men's eyes, but he would not recognize that. That in fact he would continue to honor and to serve the God who had protected, preserved, provided for him, and even elevated and exalted him in the kingdom of Babylon through multiple administrations of kings, which was an amazing aspect of his grace anyway. He continued to do this. Verse 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Now, doesn't that sound kind of familiar? They bring before Jesus a woman who is caught in the very act of adultery. Well, what the heck are you doing in that lady's bedroom, buddy? What are you doing on the roof of Daniel's house? What are you doing there? You didn't have permission to be there. I don't see anywhere where they knocked. But they're there. They were premeditated. They caught him. They didn't have their smartphone, so there's no paparazzi. They had to see him with their eyeballs. They came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. In his own words. And those words, just like the injunction, would be part of the record as things that had been said and spoken in the court. Now he's on record, having made the injunction, having confirmed that the injunction is true and valid. They're to be cast into the lion's den if they violate it. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king. We'll scratch your itch, buddy, but he doesn't scratch your itch. He pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Remember, Daniel is the most exceptional administrator in the kingdom. He's so exceptional that he can replace 122 other administrators in the kingdom, potentially. Daniel has violated that injunction. Now, just at a professional level, the king realizes that without Daniel, it's very likely that the kingdom of Babylon becomes an administrative train wreck. Without his leadership, without his decision, without his wisdom, without the extraordinary spirit that is within him. And he has been radically impressed in a relatively short time with Daniel's abilities. And so immediately, probably just in complete and total self-interest as the king under another king here in Babylon, knowing that if he makes a train wreck out of the kingdom of Babylon, it's his hide as much as it is Daniel. He comes, and he was deeply distressed when he heard this statement, when he heard that Daniel had been witnessed by eyeballs praying and petitioning to God. Deeply distressed, like in turmoil, and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. He did everything that he could possibly do, but there's nothing to be done. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. This may be Darius' first time around the block as king. He did not consider the ramifications or the consequences of his actions, but this is not surprising. Many government proclamations, many government laws and principles come about the same way, where people do not understand the unintended consequences of what they're doing. And this is only 30 days. Now, doesn't this sound familiar? It's only temporary. It's just for right now. It's 30 days. It's going to cost this man his life. It may cost the kingdom its stability. It may cost them their economy. It may cost them an absence of corruption. It may cost Darius himself his life when this kingdom becomes a train wreck. All because he allowed some men in his court to scratch a particular itch and signed an injunction before he had sought other counsel. And now they tell him, we've got you in a corner. You can't get out of this. You can't change this law. Verse 16, then the king gave orders. And Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. I hope. I really hope, Daniel, for all of our sakes. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Sealed it up, the stone, very similar to a tomb. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. You know what? It strikes me that he's in far greater turmoil outside the lion's den than Daniel is inside of it. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? He needs to go talk to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, doesn't he? It's not a question of God's ability, is it? But in his mind, it is. We sealed him in. We put him in a tomb as good as a tomb. We put a big rock over it. We sealed it with our rings. Nobody's going to touch it upon pain of death. Has he been able? But Daniel didn't correct his theology on that point. Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. Inasmuch as I was found innocent before him and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. I have committed no crime. Now, had he committed a crime, well, here's, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, whatever. All of the standard disclaimers apply, but there are things that are what's referred to as malum prohibitum. They're illegal because they're illegal. Some guy made a law. That's what this is. It was not morally wrong. It was not recognized under common law or by humanity or by civilization that it was wrong to bring petitions and prayers to anybody else aside from Darius the Mede, the king of Babylon. There was no crime committed. It was victimless. It was not malum in se, something that is, in fact, morally reprehensible, something universally recognized as being immoral and wrong. And Daniel is saying, I have made no violation of morality. I've made no violation of any natural law, any law before God, and any rightly proclaimed law of the kingdom of Babylon. I'm innocent. I'm innocent, no matter what my judicial record here says. No matter what these 122 loonies over here have tricked you into doing, I am innocent. I am innocent, he says. I've committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased, even though Daniel has called him a dummy, practically speaking. The king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. The kingdom is saved, by the way. Here with this able administrator back in the saddle, Daniel is taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in God. That was the only thing that he could trust in. He couldn't trust in the fact that the lions had been given a sandwich before they got to him. Any of that. He couldn't get out. There was a big stone. He's an old man. Nothing. He couldn't trust in his strength. He couldn't trust in his wisdom. He had to trust only in God, as was his habit. No injury was found on him. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, their wives into the lion's den. This was similar to Nebuchadnezzar kind of whipped out and I'll kill you, your family, I'll tear your house down to dust, and no one will ever remember your name kind of punishment. A little more flamboyant, right? You're going to go down to the lion's den. They cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. Now, our modern sensibilities find that reprehensible in some ways, right? Well, what did their wives and their children do? Let me remind you of something that you may have forgotten, that malice and sin against the righteous, that sin has victims, and it's not only the person you're malicious towards. Fathers, husbands, mothers, and wives, if you are engaged in malicious actions towards other people, you will cause suffering for your own family. And that is something that we see throughout Scripture. That is not individualistic, that it has far-reaching ramifications way beyond the individuals that are involved here. And that was a recognition that was common in the ancient Near East. Now, they may have had some interesting reasons for it, but frequently, people's whole household suffered the consequences of their leadership. I consider that something of an inviolable principle in Scripture as well. That it is just the natural course of events that people suffer for the actions of their leadership. That's not just even biblical, that's historical. It says this, they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. There was nothing left to bury. A lion, from what I understand, is capable of actually licking the meat off of a bone. Think of the sandpapery texture you've got to have. I mean, their tongues are like belt sanders. And before they even hit the ground, some people have talked about Daniel and the lions, that maybe the lions were tame, maybe they weren't hungry. Well, that proves that wrong. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, the nations, and men of every language who are living in all the land, may your peace abound. And it probably will, because Daniel is back in the saddle. Daniel is back in charge of the administration of this kingdom. And so your peace very likely will abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. See, Darius had just destroyed a kingdom. He knew that earthly kingdoms could be destroyed pretty regularly. He knew that his own kingdom could be destroyed. In fact, I really do believe that that is why he feared for his kingdom's existence without the presence of Daniel ably administering the laws and the economy of that kingdom. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. In other words, what Darius is saying is, I have heard tell of what this God has done. I have heard the stories. I've seen the things. I've seen it in our own historical record in the kingdom of Babylon. But this also happens to be the same guy who delivered Daniel from the mouths of the lions. It's just one thing in the line of signs and wonders that we have seen as Babylon from this one true living God. I think it's interesting that a pagan king like this would refer to him as the living God. He clearly knows the difference between his own gods and those gods. He clearly knew when he made the decree that he would be more effective in answering the petitions of his people than any of the chunks of firewood that they were praying to. He didn't understand the consequences as it related to those who served the one true living God. The phrase, fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, you may understand this. That was something of an idiom for worshiping. They were there. That would be how anyone would describe the worship of a God who wielded that kind of power. And so they're to fear and to tremble before him. But this last verse, so this Daniel enjoyed success. He enjoyed success. Ongoing success, not the results of his past successes. He continued to distinguish himself. He continued to experience success in the purpose that he had in his life. He enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He's a remarkable man who lived his life fully, trusting in God at every juncture, but also pursuing excellence and embracing every single aspect of every gift that he was given as we read this text. It's remarkable. So that's Daniel chapter 6. As always, you can feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I know that this is a little bit different than our normal Sunday school class in which we can stop and consider and ask questions or even engage a couple of snide remarks from the peanut gallery. But if you just feel the need to send one of those on, you can send an email to me or comment on this video or text me and ask those questions or make those snide remarks or even an accusation of heresy if you feel like it. We'll see you next time for Daniel chapter 7.